In this lesson, we will continue our look at functions in Python by exploring arguments, keyword arguments, as well as default values. On screen, I've already created a very simple function, and this is just createSphere, and it takes in 6 arguments currently: translate x, translate y, translate z, as well as scale x, scale y, and scale z. And down below, outside of the function, I just have a statement which calls the function and passes in the 6 values, or the 6 arguments. So the first one would be translate x, followed by translate y, and so on. And then when I run the code, you can see that I'm printing out my translate values as well as my scale values. As this function is written currently, all 6 of these values are required and must be provided when calling the function. And that's exactly what we're doing down below. We're passing in 0s for the translates and 1s for the scales. But it's not necessary to require your users to always input every single argument. And this is where default values come in. You want to allow your user the option to include an argument. And if they don't include it, it will fall back to a default value. And to create a default value for an argument, all you have to do is follow your argument name with a default value. So for this, I'm just going to set the scale to 1 in x, 1 in y, and 1 in z. So here you can see I have the name of my argument, followed by the equals sign, and finally the default value. Now, when I call the function, I can get rid of the 3 scale values. And when I run it, you'll see that the scale is still being included using the default values. If I change these default values to 2, and again run the code, now you'll see that the scale is being set to 2. Users then have the option to override these default values. So if I'd like to change the scale when I call the function, all I have to do is provide the values for it. So here I'll set the scale to 10. And as you can see, the new values I've provided to the function are being used instead of the default values. Now what if I only want to override the value of scale x? As this is currently written, you can see that I have to set the value of scale x to the default value, as well as the value of scale y to its default value before I can change scale z. However, if I take advantage of keyword arguments, this is no longer necessary. Because there's already default values for scale x and scale y, I don't have to pass those values in. I do have to tell Python, though, the name of the argument that I wish to alter. So in this case, I want to alter scale z. And here I'm going to set its value to 10. When I run this now, you can see that my scale is using the default values for x and y, and altering the value of scale z as I've told it to when I called the function. Similarly, if I change this to scale y and run it again, now sy is being altered while the other 2 values remain at their default values. So once again, this is known as a keyword argument. Now there are some things you need to be aware of when using them. The keyword arguments will always come after required arguments in a function. So it's not possible for me to move this keyword argument to the front of the function and call it before the required translate x, translate y, and translate z. If I try to run this now, I'm going to get an error stating that a non-keyword argument is coming after a keyword argument. I can, however, order this in any way that I like, as long as I'm using all keyword arguments And I'm providing values for all of my required arguments. So here I can pass in tx equals 0, ty equals 0, and tz equals 0. And when I run this, you'll see that it works just fine, even though tx, ty, and tz are required arguments and they come before the scale arguments. Now, I don't recommend writing it this way. It's generally a good practice to keep your required arguments before your optional arguments, just for maintenance down the road. One final example with this create sphere example. I'm going to provide default values for tx, ty, and tz. And now it's possible to remove all of the required arguments when calling this function. There will be times when you find having the defaults are good enough. And this makes it very simple for me to adjust one single value or two values when I'm calling this function. And this is great when you have to call a function over and over again, and you only have to modify one or two of the arguments. So in this case, I could set translate z to 5. Maybe I want to change scale x. So this would just be sx equals 2. And now when I run this, you'll see that translate z has been updated correctly. And I should give my scale something other than default, just for clarity. So I'll set this to 3. And now with my scale value, scale x is set to 3, while y and z both use the default values. So working with default values in your functions, as well as using keyword arguments to call those functions, can be a great time saver. And I would recommend taking advantage of this inside of your code.